but what is Vladimir Putin's goal in Ukraine? Is it a greater new Russia or something else? And now that Russian atrocities are becoming more evident, should Western powers push for a compromise peace or for punitive measures against Russia like those imposed on Germany in the 1919 Versailles Treaty? Back in the US, should we congratulate Elon Musk on becoming the largest shareholder in Twitter and hope that he will strike a blow for free speech? And how about we ask Mickey Mouse how it's working out for Disney to take sides in the culture wars? We'll talk about all this and more in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hi, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try to give you a take on the issues of the day that doesn't quite fit into standard categories, but instead takes an independent look. Today, I am joined by my two colleagues, often ready to talk with me about anything under the sun. First of all, David Theroux, founder and president of Independent Institute. Hello, David.
Hi, Graham. Good to be here.
Great to see you. Also by Williamson Evers, Bill Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill.
Hello, Graham.
Great to see you. And we are also always pleased to have so many of our friends join us from across the country and actually overseas sometimes too. Many of you are joining via our YouTube page, Facebook page, through Vimeo, through Twitter, and we welcome especially all of our friends coming to us through thinkspot.com. And so we are also able to take comments and questions through all those different channels, and they will be, if you write your comments in the chat function, those will be funneled to me, and I'll be happy to take your questions as we move along today. So, gentlemen, let's talk about Ukraine and Russia. I mean, what's Putin up to? It looked like at the beginning he wanted to just have a quick take and grab Kyiv for himself and install a new government, but that didn't work out. Now, apparently, he's withdrawn from forces from around Kyiv and moved them to the east and to the south. What do you think is the aim here? Because if we understand Putin's goal, then we might have a sense of what the possible solutions or end games might be, peace, ceasefire, whatever. Bill, what do you think Putin is up to?
Well, it's hard to say. He could come back to Kyiv. At the very beginning, it looked like he wanted to take the entirety of Ukraine. Then it seemed like he was only looking at Kyiv and south and to the east, with maybe Odessa in the works. Now that he's retreated from around Kyiv, but of course he could come back, people are speculating that what he might be trying to do is annex or put in a puppet government in the area called New Russia or Novorossiya. And this is an area that Russia conquered at the time of Catherine the Great. And her famous minister, Potemkin, for whom Potemkin villages are named, was the administrator of this area. And so if you could show the map of where Novorossiya is, so you can see the shaded area there, and it stretches from the Donbass region in the east up to Kharkiv, and it goes across the south coastal region to Odessa and over to Moldova there.
And so, the reason we think this might be a plausible aim is why again?
I think it's because that's where the troops and fighting are principally located now. And so, it's hard to say because we can't read his mind. We don't have access to what he's telling people close to him. But I think this is plausible. Now, there was a New Statesman, which is a British slightly left of center publication, had an extensive translated interview with one person in Putin's inner circle.
Sergei Karaganov, honorary chair of the Moscow think tank, the Council for Foreign and Defense Policy.
Exactly. So he had a lot of horrifying things to say, but one of them is we can't lose, we can't afford to lose. If we lose, it's a loss to the West. We're essentially at war at the West, if it's at we Russia, or even if the fighting is not directly against NATO powers. And he suggested, annexation, or maybe Hungary and Poland and Moldova and so forth would take pieces, and Russia would take a piece. So the idea would be there would be no real entity of the Ukraine, and he thought it was a fake country also.
This sounds so 19th century or earlier.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so that's the situation. Now, as to what, we have to think about what Zelensky and the politicians in Ukraine are thinking about, and we also have to think about the very hopped up rhetoric in the United States these days. I mean, both the Wall Street Journal, Garry Kasparov, the chess champion, and the New York Times with Bret Stephens have both said that Biden's supposed gaffe that Putin should be overthrown, that should be followed up on.
Well, that wasn't what he said. He just said he shouldn't be in power.
Shouldn't stay in power any longer. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Be in power any longer. Well, anyway, they doubled down on that, and they're hardly the only ones to have done so. And we're starting to see people say the United States should go in full, with troops, with forces, and things like this. Not many people, but a few people. So Zelensky has this problem that, because of the atrocities, because of the pain of war, because of the rising nationalism, it's very hard for him to come to a compromise. The Russians the Russians, obviously, their propaganda is super nationalistic, and they're saying that the country doesn't even deserve to exist. So it's very hard for them to come to some kind of compromise.
The comment from Karaganov was so interesting. He said, just verbatim, you referred to it, but he said, Russia cannot afford to lose a war. We need a kind of victory.
Yeah. Well, both sides need to be able to claim a kind of victory. It's hard for us, sort of neutrally sitting here, not the three of us, not fighting or something, not being government officials. We could say, well, give Crimea back to the Crimean Tatars, or give the small two puppet republics there in the east. Maybe they should succeed. They seem to be pretty fanatically pro-Russian. It wouldn't probably harm, but maybe the people there may have changed their minds, witnessing the warfare and some of the atrocities. So it's a very difficult thing to say, how do people get out of this? I do think it's amazing the ludicrousness and wild exaggerations in the Russian propaganda that's being fed to the people there.
I feel sorry for the Russian people.
We, of course, don't yet know some things that we think are true may be also propaganda. War is a war of propaganda, not just of arms and shooting and so forth.
Truth is the first casualty.
Yes.
Isn't it, though? Yeah, and I want to turn further to David, because, the more the evidence of Russian atrocities builds up, as in these areas that they withdrew from recently and, just littered with corpses, the more indignation builds up. He's a tyrant. He's horrible. And the more that awful reality hits the Western public and the American public, the more there is a felt need to do something physically about it.
It's like the atrocities in Cuba in 1898 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm thinking of Saddam Hussein
the killing of Belgians, much of which was exaggerated in World War I and so forth.
Well, it's like the woman who was talking about babies being taken out of incubators and put on the cold floor that prompted the Iraq War, I believe. Is that right?
It was during the Iraq War.
Plus
so that was not
Saddam.
That was a paid agent. But anyway,
Saddam Hussein,
many
the daughter of
official,
the minister.
Right?
Yeah.
So atrocities.
Saddam Hussein was
place.
feeding people into those shredders and so forth, and that was one of the things that prompted,
Saddam was a brutal person. There's no doubt about it. But terrible exaggerations take place in wartime, and governments, the figures in government are somewhat at the mercy of an aroused public. They can only fend it off so much.
Right.
Right. And so, again, the question is, is this conflict one that has much to do with America's national security?
That's right. That's exactly well put by David. Is this
There
somehow
are places in
a
the
vital?
world that have far more atrocities, including in Ethiopia and other countries, and yet there are no cameras recording them.
Right.
And so it's not to minimize or to ignore the reality of the barbarism that Putin is doing. But the difference in this case, even comparing it to the U.S. efforts against Gaddafi and against Saddam and so on, is that Russia has nuclear weapons. And to save face, if Putin is backed up, we don't know exactly how far he would go. As this interview discusses, Kragnikov, is that how I pronounce it?
Yeah, I think so.
Is saying that we have to save face, but he wasn't sure exactly where that point is.
Right.
I do think that he's right that a partition is probably the most likely outcome and probably the best outcome as far as giving a face-saving situation to Putin and also Zelensky, rather. But the calls to send in U.S. troops and warplanes and
many American people, either retired military or members of Congress, are saying the goal must be victory over Putin. They're saying that over and over, instead of let's get to a peace as soon as we can and try to get people back at least to the status quo ante.
Right. And I think that the interview also clearly discusses how the buildup, the eastern expansion of NATO and the European Union and the U.S.'s involvement, significant involvement in Ukraine, led to Putin basically saying we have no choice. And so I think that's the message, the propaganda message, of course, that Putin is giving to the Russian people and censoring anything other than that. But I believe that is, as far as geopolitics is concerned, and the history of Russia is certainly a clear explanation of the thinking. But again, the point is, how do we get out from under this with a minimum number of people harmed in the process? And it's certainly not sending in U.S. troops.
So I saw a story today saying that the Czech Republic is sending old Russian-style tanks to Ukraine, and that Poland and Czech Republic are pondering being repair shops. So the Ukrainian armored vehicles, many of them have been harmed during the war. The Ukrainians have captured a fair amount of equipment from the Russians, but that it's somewhat damaged. And so it's possible that these countries will become repair shops. On the other hand, Putin has said that any arms shipments coming into Ukraine are legitimate targets. So, this is very dangerous.
Right. And so if they send in these reconditioned Russian tanks and they're successful in fending off the Russian assault, then Putin is pushed against a wall and he's going to strike back because he wants to save face. And so I think it's not exactly an intelligent poker move, I would suggest.
And
well, the whole thing is just terribly fraught with peril. It's just all very dangerous.
That's right. Absolutely.
And if those countries...
And I think Biden, one interesting about the interview that's worth pointing out too, is, Biden has been pretty irresponsible in basically excusing chemical weapons, sending in the different army divisions, essentially, and so on, and then having the White House backtrack on that the next day. And so this particular interview points out that the Russians see that as an indication that that Biden doesn't know what he's talking about, and they don't take it seriously.
On the other hand, they can just be veiled, coy threats.
They could be veiled, coy threats, and it could also be Biden being stupid and giving away what the U.S. is really doing.
It's a mess.
Yep.
We've got a friend on the line, Dick, who says, I don't understand, why are we so slow getting weapons into Ukraine? This is coming to us through one of our platforms. Are we being so slow, do you think, in getting weapons into Ukraine?
I think, one of the problems is a week's worth of incoming weapons are used by the Ukrainians in one day.
Right.
So this battle, this fighting, takes up a huge amount of weapons. And so, the three of us are not, I just heard somebody saying, well, now we're the arsenal of democracy, going back to a phrase from the
I was going to say, that sounds familiar.
early 1940s. But the point is, the American public has not deliberated through its representatives in Congress that it wants to get sucked into World War III. So, this arming of one of the belligerents is a very dangerous thing. And so, I don't think that there's some kind of intentional slowing of arms flow into Ukraine. But remember, another thing to remember is no arms are going through Hungary. So Hungary has a small frontier with Ukraine, but the leader of Hungary, although he's condemned the Russian invasion, he is strictly neutral, and if anything, repeats some of the Russian propaganda claims.
I want to come back to a point that David was making. When people hear you say, David, that we shouldn't send U.S. fighter planes or U.S. troops or whatever into the situation, I agree with you. But I can imagine a reaction of someone who might say, well, don't you care about those murdered babies?
Well, this doesn't, as I've mentioned in earlier Independent Outlook programs, I think Americans should be free to support and volunteer and organize like any other group, but privately if they want to send their sons and daughters off to this war.
And we also know somebody.
But it should not be anything close to official policy of the U.S. government.
We know the three of us, or at least two of us, know Tom Palmer, who is a longtime classical liberal missionary, so to speak, and he is in Ukraine. There's actually a picture of him on Facebook at Ludwig von Mises's birthplace in Lviv. Von Mises was born in Lviv. It was called Lemberg in those days. But so Palmer, usually is bringing in pamphlets and books and holding seminars, but right now he's using these connections to bring in things like body armor and food and things like that. And so that's very courageous of him. And so, we think that's okay if people want to do things like that. That's, it's very dangerous for them, of course.
David,
well, after the 9/11 attack, we proposed that there be a letter of marque. Now, it was a different instance because the U.S. mainland was attacked.
Right.
But one of the things that came out of that was there was at least one billionaire in Silicon Valley, I believe it was a group, that wanted to put together $1 billion bounty fund to go after the culprits behind the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and so on. And those kinds of efforts, I think, are perfectly legitimate and could be encouraged to support at least the protection of the innocent people who are being attacked. But the view that the only way we can respond to this is by sending in armor divisions and stealth bombers and so on is not true and is just very dangerous.
Your comment, David, speaks to a question we're getting from one of our Facebook participants, Elena, who says she'd be curious to know whether your view of whether there would be any more effective measures to stop Russia's aggression in Ukraine rather than the extensive economic sanctions
Yes.
and the withdrawal of all investment in commercial companies. So your
That's
letter
that's
of
what
marque,
that's what David was talking about.
Yeah.
Response to that.
Well, the number
question.
one way to affect Putin is to eliminate all these restrictions on oil and gas production in the United States.
absolutely.
Exactly.
If they did that, the futures market of oil and energy would be affected immediately,
Right.
and you'd have massive production. I believe that the
price of
the
oil would
premier-
drop. The revenues to the Russian
drop.
government would
absolutely
drop, fall
and
through
that's
the floor.
it's the whole green agenda on climate is what's funding Putin's ability to wage this war, because the Russian oil price, he's making enormous amounts of money, even though certain markets are cut off to him. He can sell it to China, he can sell it to lots of places.
And it's a world
And
market.
It's a world market. So it's a simple measure, but the Greens are against it, and Biden needs the Greens to stay in power.
Plus,
Yeah,
of course,
I mean-
Democratic
plus,
Party.
of course, they're trying to.
So which is it? Which is it? Do they care about the price that the average person has to pay and the well-being of the people in the Ukraine, or is it some fly-by-night climate alarmist agenda, which is unscientifically verified? And I think that's the side they're taking.
Well,
Plus-
David,
plus-
the thing is that the people who tenaciously cling to the green agenda, they would say, well, we don't intend through our green agenda to be helping a barbarian like Putin.
Mhm.
That's not our intent.
I
Well,
know.
they're
But
trying.
essentially, that is the effect.
They're trying.
Exactly, the effect.
They're trying to.
And this has been pointed out to them, and they will not move.
So they're trying to flip this, though, both Biden and the Green activists. So they're saying, well, if we didn't need any gasoline and any natural gas, then Putin wouldn't be making money from exports. And therefore, let's coercively shut down the industrial economy, and then there won't be that problem. Of course, the economy would collapse. And even if there were low-cost alternatives to fossil fuels, the economy is not going to turn overnight, not during the time of this Russian invasion, to those other alternatives, which are now very costly and unreliable.
There's absolutely no way that renewables
Right.
can replace the use of oil,
I'm not disagreeing.
ever. And certainly not in 10 years or 50 years. It's just the efficiency are not there. You'd have to put solar panels over the entire globe. And you still wouldn't even come
which would be
close to it.
terrible for the environment, I should add.
Well, the other part of this is think about the price of oil as it affects developing countries. And most people don't seem to think about it. It's not just the gasoline in your car. It's all the products made from plastic. It's fertilizers. It's all sorts of things that are part of the modern economy. And if you shut down or radically reduce the use of oil and gas, you end up harming billions of people. So what is the point?
The point is we don't care about the billions of people. We want our
That's right.
way.
You want our way, and of course the population control aspect of this is also part of this thinking as well.
So
But I think that is the simple. Anyway, the point is as I was making, the simplest way to stop Putin is to essentially unleash the fossil fuel industry. The price of oil will plummet.
His
And he
revenues will
essentially-
plummet.
I forget, it was John McCain. John McCain said that Russia is simply a gas station. And without being able to sell the gas, they don't have the capital. They don't have the finances to fight a war.
I think we could turn to another development.
But I have another point though
All
I
right.
wanted to make before you turn over there, Bill. I just wanted to comment in response to David that when people say, well, those behind the green agenda, they want to win. The sad thing is that those who are tenaciously holding on to that so-called green agenda and the climate alarmism and so forth, it's not just that they want to win, it's that they have become persuaded that their way of looking at the world is accurate and other ways are not. I think that it's a delusion, but it's a deeply felt and deeply held delusion,
Yes.
which needs to be undone, not just by scoffing at them, obviously, but by giving them information that would enable them to see that what they intend is not the effect that they're producing, and that their way of interpreting the world economically and otherwise and environmentally is simply not based on facts. That could pry them away from the fanaticism.
It's basically the Malthusian theory is repackaged essentially and brought into the modern world, and climate is used as the rationale for it.
Indeed.
And so our book, Hot Talk Cold Science, carefully goes through the evidence and shows that there is no climate crisis now or in the foreseeable future, certainly. And the measures that they're using to shut down are creating enormous problems, and a likelihood that other conflicts will break out if this continues around the world with the price of oil is certainly not something that we should be surprised about, because people are going to be desperate.
So
And
I was
recommend
wondering
that people do look at our book, Hot Talk Cold Science, for the evidence that we're talking about.
There's also a number of excellent videos on our YouTube channel I should point out too.
But go ahead, Bill.
I wondered if we could turn to an unexpected development, which has been Elon Musk, the entrepreneur behind Tesla cars, has purchased a 9% holding in Twitter.
9.2%.
Right. And
The
what
0.2 is not insignificant.
Well, anyway, he's the largest stockholder, and the company has announced he's going to be on the board of directors.
Right.
And I wondered if we could share some thoughts we might have on this with our listening audience.
Well, it looks like Elon has something in mind for the company. He did a second filing with the SEC, noting that he is going to be an active, not merely a passive shareholder. He's got a seat on the board. Before he made it all public that he had acquired all these shares, he did a Twitter poll asking people whether they thought that Twitter was being faithful to free speech principles, and some 70% said no, Twitter wasn't. He clearly has in mind to either reform Twitter or maybe later compete with it if it doesn't reform. Don't you think?
I think so. And the great thing about this is, as was pointed out by the Wall Street Journal in an editorial, is this is a free enterprise solution, a private property solution to a problem that has arisen, because so many people have been using Twitter as their way of communicating and debating and gathering news. And the platform was getting so politically biased and so much thorough editing and monitoring that it was becoming painful for many users. And some liberalization of its practices will benefit the company and will benefit these users. And Musk had the entrepreneurial insight to realize this. And so it's not the same as the government imposing this on Twitter, although, sometimes threats do come from governments to things like Twitter and the other platforms. But I think this is a free enterprise alternative to what a lot of people in Congress have been working their way toward.
I do want to add, though, that Twitter has defrauded a lot of people because they claimed initially that they were going to be a free speech platform, that you could express your views and debates, a public forum, and that was the appeal of Twitter. But that's turned out to be not the case. So I think there's a fraudulent basis to their behavior. I also think that...
And there was the fraud connected to the truck convoy in Canada.
That's right.
So
the other part is there was a great study. I guess I'm looking at an article from NBC News in July 2020 that really sort of broke the silence on the name of the title. Thousands of contracts highlight quiet ties between big tech and the U.S. military.
Wow.
So it's Google, it's Microsoft, it's all these firms have massive numbers of contracts, and they hide it through some contract arrangements that you can only learn about through Freedom of Information lawsuits. But this is quite enormous.
But I do think we have to conclude provisionally that this is optimistic news.
It is optimistic news, and predictably, there was a report that the people who are involved in the censoring of material
they're
on Twitter,
aghast, they're upset,
Right.
they're distraught.
So they've stated that although the company's board, i.e., including Musk, quote, plays an important advisory and feedback role, policy decisions are not determined by the board or shareholders, and we have no plans to reverse any policy decisions.
I
huffy.
think some of them may discover they're getting their walking papers because
Well, Joe Ellen Posner, who's a law professor at Santa Clara University, is quoted as saying, "I would not be surprised if there were shakeups of various sorts following this development.
Oh, I would not
I
be
think the
surprised.
employees may learn that the CEO is hired by the board,
yeah,
and the board determines policy for the company."
exactly. As it
So
should,
I think-
as it should.
Right, as it should, exactly. So I think the bottom line is that Bill is absolutely right, that private firms make the rules based on the rule of law and based on the contracts they have. If they go different from that, they're accountable. But overall, the point is, even when you do that, there are competitive pressures. And I think Musk entry into this, he was talking about starting his own platform at one point. I think
Which
he
might
decided
still,
this is
which
a
might
lot-
still happen if
it
it
might.
becomes too recalcitrant.
Right, exactly. But at least he's seen this as an opportunity that might be less costly and less complicated, and also helps him gain more a bigger public persona
Right.
of doing the right thing.
Right.
I like the fact that Elon said about 10 days ago that Twitter, quote, Twitter serves as the de facto public town square.
Right.
And he's right. Of course, the word de facto is important. It's not legally the governmental town square, but it is de facto socially the town square.
Well, this actually reminds me of a horrible case called the Pruneyard case, Supreme Court case, where so there was a parking lot of a shopping center, and people were engaged in political activity, and the owners of the shopping center said, "Get off our land," and they sued, saying, "Well, this parking lot is a public forum." So anyway, the public forum doctrine, as a legal doctrine, is fraught with peril for property rights.
It sure is. Yeah.
So, but anyway,
Also-
as a metaphor, it's all right. I think it's
as a
true.
metaphor.
It's true that Twitter is a kind of major public forum, and this is part of this larger culture war. I think one of the most fascinating things in the culture war is this material that Christopher Rufo got from the Disney employees, showing their internal deliberations, their instruction on what they're going. They're not going to say, "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls" anymore in Disneyland.
Heaven forbid.
That they're going to have all these characters that have a multitude of sexualities and racial and it's all a political agenda instead of a kind of fairy tale story agenda and a fantasy agenda,
And innocence.
and it's aimed at very young children, and so there's a lot of concern among the public about this. Again, there's a property rights solution. If you don't like Disneyland in Anaheim,
Right.
you can go to Knott's Berry Farm or other parks that are around. And similarly, in Orlando, there are other venues. So it's the company's decision. We can make judgments about the wisdom of it. We can make moral judgments about where they're going with this, but the market will also supply pressure to them. They're already
right.
losing immense customer base out of this.
Their branding is really plummeting. But
right.
one thing also, Bill, even in although the area where Disney is located, Disney World is located, came into fruition essentially in prosperity with all the other amusement parks and so on because of Disney World. Disney World was given exemption by the state.
They allowed it to be a municipality of its own.
Right. Now, I'm in favor of proprietary communities, but they get subsidy, but they actually get financial subsidies and other benefits that none of these other parks have.
Give it to all the other parks.
Well, my view is to remove the subsidies. Anyway, I think that
it's certainly now
true,
become a political controversy in Florida as to whether they should have
Right.
any special treatment.
competition is a great thing. I mean, for example, competition among different governments around the world as far as income tax rates, including business tax rates, are major factors in where businesses will locate. It's true in the United States as well. It's true.
I noticed that the
has been
attempt
true.
at a uniform corporate tax has been shunted aside, at least temporarily. Poland
Right.
has vetoed it for the EU, and
Mhm.
U.S. Congress can't seem to come to a conclusion about it.
That's right.
I also
And it's-
noticed that Wired.
But that doesn't excuse the income tax that exists in
No,
those countries.
no, of
But
course.
the point is that the relative differences competing is an important thing.
Right.
And this proposal for a global tax wanted to eliminate that competition.
Yes, it did. That was its purpose, a stated purpose. So also Wired, which is a conservative platform, has announced that it's putting, I don't know, $100 million. It's small potatoes compared to Disney's capitalization into children's programming. So there are going to be competition to Disney that Disney opens itself up to. It's tough though. You know, it's like the problems with the Boy Scouts. You know, some people will set up alternative Boy Scouts, but the regular Boy Scouts have been around a long time. And
You can now be a
tough.
girl and be in the Boy Scouts too. They
That's
changed
another
their
thing.
policy. Mhm.
We can't cover
one thing-
everything, but that's another side part of this.
But going back to Disney, I mean, is
Yeah.
it really appropriate for the recipient of special government privileges conferred by the state of Florida, as in their municipal status, for that entity then to be putting political and financial pressure on the state of Florida to rescind its recently enacted legislation on K through grade 3 educational standards on sexual matters? Is that really
Not only
appropriate?
that, but the company is based in California.
Yeah, right.
And so, I mean, the whole thing is a confusion. But even take the simple things like saying we're not going to say ladies and gentlemen and boys and girls. The point about that is they don't want to mention girls and women because women do not exist anymore.
What can they do? They have Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse. They have
I know. That's right. And so the
innumerable,
point is that
innumerable princesses. They have
Yes,
Snow White.
of
I
course,
mean, what are
Cinderella's
they
castle.
going to do? They're ruined.
They're going to basically make it so-called a gender fluid environment. And they want to target young children because they believe that the nuclear family essentially creates bigotry among young children. They want to get them as early as possible to expose them to this gender fluid ideology. That's the point.
I mean, I suppose we could say that if a private
It's
company...
a cultural Marxist critique of the family. Is what
That's
it is.
right.
If
yeah.
they want to abolish Tinkerbell, don't
Yeah.
believe in fairies. That's what I say.
But it would seem that here we've got a major company highly dependent upon a pretty standard, middle-of-the-road constituency that is in the process of trying to commit market suicide by taking sides in the culture war. Why does Disney have to take sides in the culture war? I should think its stockholders would be wondering why it has to take sides in the culture war.
Well, that's exactly what's going to happen because as the shares start to go down and the attendance to the parks are the biggest part of their business and the branding and so on. And once that becomes real, then shareholders are going to demand changes. And so,
Or there'll be
I
a
think
hostile takeover.
It'll be a hostile takeover. And it's really suicidal, but a lot of the, corporate executives are, especially of public companies, are not known for having a spine. In fact, that's why they're hired. They're politicians essentially, and they try to go with the flow to keep everybody happy. And ultimately, what we see is that the pressure groups are who try to win out, and they often are the prevailing group that does in the short term. But the public, which buys the products, is not going to be happy. And so I think that we're going to see a pushback, and I think that the many people have canceled their Disney memberships.
Right.
And I know people who will not have any Disney books in their houses now for children.
Well,
Even the older books.
that's crazy.
which are fine.
That's crazy.
It is crazy.
Anyway,
But I'm
so
saying that's the
speaking
response
of
we're gonna see.
fantasy coming down to earth, the New York Times and now especially the Washington Post have acknowledged that Hunter Biden's laptop is real and that the contents of it are real and authentic. And immense fallout is starting to happen. It's mostly only happening on conservative media sites, Fox News, New York Post.
Well,
Wall
except
Street
for the
Journal,
fact that
but-
the Washington Post.
Is not a conservative site. Exactly.
Right.
Mhm.
But at least, a lot of this is because there are these hearings going on about.
And there's a law. There's a grand jury that is looking into Hunter Biden's behavior. And so,
Right.
as Jonathan Turley, the law professor, George Washington points out, the newspapers cannot deny the facticity of that grand jury and what it's looking into.
Right. And I also think that there are plenty of people in the media who believe that Biden is a loser and they've got to replace him. They don't want Harris as the replacement. So they're trying to maneuver. But the Post in their editorial, is admitting that, yes, there's a lot there, but they're apologizing for the 18-month gap, saying that, well, they had to look into it further, which is just hooey. And
they could have looked into
really
it
embarrassing
much earlier.
it's embarrassing to read this effort to try to apologize for the media not taking it seriously when it was clearly corruption on the part of the media.
So the Post's
trying to-
explanation was, from my standpoint, and I think from the three of us standpoint, very bizarre. So the supposed lesson of 2016, according to them, was that Russia did manipulate the
Yes.
U.S. election, and therefore you shouldn't trust anything that has possibly anything to do with Russia. Of course, the flimsy, completely laughable few memes that Russian people put out during the 2016 election had no effect on anything. That is the most bizarre suggestion in the world. And then they said that, so that justifies in the 2020 election ignoring this, and the 51 intelligence community officials saying it's Russian disinformation, the media using that as their backstop. By the way, the Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee have written to those 51 people and say, please justify what you did then, because if you don't, we're sending subpoenas to you to give us your internal communications out. Some of this kind of bothers me as a free speech, freedom of assembly type of person, but these intelligence officials really tried to interfere in election dialogue in a kind of ugly, deceptive way. And intelligence people are experienced in deception. So,
And the Post is, in their editorial is claiming that there was no cover up during the 18 months. And the claims that Rudy Giuliani had when he turned over the
okay, so you say, Rudy Giuliani, you're slightly suspect. We're going to dig into this right away.
Yeah,
you don't
exactly.
drop the ball.
But to Giuliani's credit, he kept a copy of everything on the laptop.
Exactly.
Smart.
So if they try to deny things, he can just pull the information out.
Exactly. So now another new development is, of course, President Biden said numerous times, oh, my son Hunter never talked to me at all about his business. Forget him traveling on Air Force Two with me. Forget, meetings at Cafe Milano. Forget pictures of me with. But now he wrote a letter of recommendation to Brown University for the son of the Chinese son of the CEO of this investment firm that his son was a partner in, Chinese investment firm. And he wrote this letter of recommendation for this kid Now, how do you write a letter of recommendation for somebody without saying to your son who asked you to do it, who is this guy?
Exactly.
Why am I writing this letter? It's completely implausible to anyone who's ever had anything to do with college admissions, a kid going to college, themselves going to college, to say that someone writes a letter of recommendation and they don't know anything about what's going on. This is transparent
It's
deception and
strange.
falsehood on the part of the president.
Earlier today, during a press conference, Peter Doocy of Fox, he asked Jen Psaki if it was common for President Biden to do favors for Hunter Biden's international business partners, like writing college recommendations, and she refused to answer.
Yeah, right.
And then he asked, "What did the president get in return for doing that favor?" Again,
right.
no answer. This
Exactly.
is kind of strange.
He has a very excellent manner because he's completely calm and kind of,
He's cheery and nice.
and he's kind of cutely, matter of fact about it. And Jen Psaki, you can see why she's retiring, right? It's just an impossible.
She's going to MSNBC.
She's in an impossible position.
Yeah, anybody in that position is.
Well, did you see what Bill Maher said about this? I thought this
yes.
was pretty interesting. 4 days ago,
Right.
he said, "Yes, of course." I'm reading verbatim from apparently a transcript. So yes, of course, when Rudy Giuliani says, "I've got some evidence," you take that with a giant thing of salt. But not 2 years. It didn't take 2 years. It looks like the left-wing media just buried the story because it wasn't part of their narrative, and that's
right.
why people don't trust the media.
Right. But I think there's another part of this, and I was just reading a paper about the results of the Church Committee investigation of the intelligence agencies
You're talking about back in the day.
back in the day. That's
Church,
right.
Church of Idaho.
Frank Church, right. And, this was about the FBI, the IRS, CIA, et cetera.
COINTELPRO.
Right. Absolutely. And so they were uncovering all this, and that led to the creation of the FISA courts and
Right.
whatever. But it also raised the issue of these intelligence agencies' influence in major media.
Right.
And there are certain people who were loyal and were basically mouthpieces for intelligence agency propaganda. I think we don't even have an inkling of what may exist now, because since then we've had the USA Patriot Act and other measures that have given even more official powers.
I think there's.
But the commission, the Church Commission, one of its revelations, I think Church at one time was said, well, what the Congress is the watchdogs of these agencies, but there's no watching of the dogs. And others made the same kind of comments. And that's essentially what we have today, is that there is essentially no oversight to what is happening. So the view of the deep state, how many FBI agents were at the January 6th protest? Was Ray Epps, a guy who is actually provoking the people to storm the barricades, and so on. We don't really know, because no one has access to the information, and it's being covered up. So the question is, how much of the media is actually sincere in what it says, or it's a mixture of their ideology and some sort of involvement with agency propaganda? We just don't know.
And I would also say, without gainsaying anything that David's saying here, is when you're a journalist, you are somewhat reliant, and you're covering a government agency. You're somewhat reliant on the good offices of the people in that agency. So let's say you're covering the Pentagon, and you start, endlessly attacking what they're doing. You're paying $1,000 for a toilet seat and on and on. Pretty soon they're not going to return your phone calls.
That's
Or
right.
they're not going to call on you at press conferences. And then, your boss at the news desk says, why aren't you getting any stories? So there are subtle incentives as well as overt collusion and subvention.
Well, this story about the Hunter Biden laptop, it bears on some of the other things we were talking about too, because, for ordinary people, people get their information off of websites, social media, and so forth. Well, this is an instance where Twitter blocked the story
Right.
because it was considered false. Facebook downranked the story in their algorithms, labeling it misinformation and so forth. And then, a long time later, it turns out that even the Washington Post and others admit that it was true. So what does that tell the average person about how they should view these social media blockages and rankings? When fact checkers are everywhere, in the media and the social media world. When fact checkers say, oh, this is misleading or false information, I think this gives people reason to doubt that these keepers of opinion, who supposedly are guarding the vulnerable public from misinformation, are themselves sometimes pretty twisted and biased.
I think
it's a very illustrative episode.
I think that your point is very good, Graham, and I think the only solution is an onerous one for members of the public, but it's to try to get your information from a variety of sources and kind of try and triangulate among them, and
I think
use
that's what we're seeing.
your
People are
knowledge
doing
of
that.
history to be suspicious of things and to know enough history so that you know how things went to the current time, and so what are more likely and less likely next steps. So, it's not that the future is determined or predictable, but these are the only kinds of checks you have. I think there's some other fascinating little tidbits that I would like to get to.
Oh, by all means. You were telling me about some weird new law in California. I didn't understand that. Tell us more, Bill.
So it's not it's a proposed law.
Oh,
so
proposed law. Okay.
So right now in California, this is not common among states around the country, but in California, you can have a sheriff who's also a coroner. So the sheriff's office also is looking at dead bodies and what caused death and things like that. So the problem, this is, you could say, okay, so what? The problem is sometimes wrongful deaths occur when people are in police custody. And so, the George Floyd case is this sort of a thing. And we've had instances like this in California. And so, and sometimes, the sheriff will say, when the sheriff's own deputies do something that was wrong, was a violation of the rights of the prisoner, and killed him, they'll say, oh, just an accidental death, and they will attempt to cover it up. And so the idea is that under the statute, if it gets passed, they would separate out the sheriff and the coroner. It might end up being slightly more expensive, but I think for civil liberties, this is a very wise thing, and I hope that it's not really a partisan thing between Democrats and Republicans. I think both could support this, and as I said, my own county of Orange County, they have them combined. In San Bernardino County, they have it. It's in some big counties in California.
It sounds just like this would be basically checks and balances at the local level.
It should be a check and balance.
Yeah.
And I think whatever the supposed reason was for uniting them, I think the need for the rights of the accused to be protected overcomes that. So I hope that passes. Speaking of jails, a funny thing happened in India. So this guy was put in jail, and he wanted some reading material. So one of his family or friends sent him a Bertie and Jeeves type book by P.G. Wodehouse, the English humorist. And the jail authority said that this was subversive and a threat to public order, and they denied a Bertie and Jeeves book into the jail. I think this has to be one of the more comic things, and certainly shows that there's plenty of ignorance
you never know
among the
what
powers that be.
Your Bertie and Jeeves might set a bad example.
Yeah.
Remember, they stole the hat from the policeman.
They did a bunch of amazing things.
Hey, here's another weird thing. I saw in the news, like this is about a month ago now, that in New York City, the mask mandate, rules have been tweaked so that entertainers and pro athletes wouldn't have to either mask or have vaccination in order to play and perform in New York City. But now, as of this week, New York says that children under 5 do have to be masked.
Right.
So
Crazy.
why do you think in New York City that the celebrities can get off scot-free, but the children have to wear masks?
Because the teachers union doesn't have power over the celebrities.
That's right.
Oh, that's the reason.
I think David has captured it exactly. By the way, a public servant, a bureaucrat from the legal department of New York City, confronted Mayor Eric Adams at a news conference and demanded to know what was going on with this thing of masking of children. And she was fired the next day.
Oh, my goodness.
It's crazy. He had said it was going to end, and then they put it back on. So I was talking to my own doctor last week about this, and she said, not only is it not effective, but these young kids, they can't keep the mask on anyway. It's crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It is
So
crazy.
it's a big imposition
So
on them.
the CEOs of the major airline companies sent a letter to Biden requesting that the mask mandate in airports across the country would be removed. And the White House refused to rescind it. And so we were just flying, Mary and I, this past weekend. And it's a totally weird thing to see all these people and these children, tiny children, wearing masks for no point.
And on the airlines
than-
themselves, they have immensely
right.
effective filters and circulation.
Exactly. In fact, except if you're outside, it turns out that the air in an airplane is probably the cleanest that you're going to find
Anywhere, right.
almost anywhere, right?
We are grateful for all of our friends who joined us. We didn't get to all the questions that I got, but thank you for sending them. Really appreciate our friends being with us. And let me give David and Bill both one last parting shot. What would you like to tell us, David?
Well, one little thing I might just throw out is that when we see instances in which there is behavior that is ongoing, which doesn't seem to match reality or common sense, the chances are pretty high that there is some sort of cartel in operation. This is an old lesson from Adam Smith. Smith said that the only time competitors will meet is when they want to get together to collude to raise prices. The problem, though, is that because the market price is below the raised price that they want to set it at, there's a great incentive for people to cheat behind the backs of the other cartel members to make more money, because they make more money at the market clearing price. So what cartels had to do was to keep everybody in line, and the way they would do that was, the mafia would, break your kneecaps in the alley, or they threaten your wife or whatever. You have to use violence.
Or a
to
regulatory
force people.
agency would control it.
Or use the government, because then the government is ipso facto in the public interest. So you get the government to police the cartel. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about censorship and prices and energy and, the schools and whatever else. And the chances are pretty high that over a period of time, if it persists, there's a cartel in operation which is being policed somehow, usually by the government.
So
Bill, parting shot from you.
So speaking of schools, I and my co-author, Ze'ev Vorman, have a chapter in a book that was just issued by the Heritage Foundation called The Critical Classroom. And it's about critical math. It's called Critical Math Doesn't Add Up. And it's about the history of left-wing politics and racial consciousness and politicalization of mathematics teaching. And it's just a fascinating saga of how the teaching of math has been distorted by these ideologically committed activists, and how they want to turn the classroom into a recruiting and training ground for future social justice warriors and green activists. And instead of just teaching math, which is hard enough for our schools to succeed at and convey what's needed to be known to the children. So I
The
recommend
title
also
is Critical Math Doesn't Add Up.
right.
Right,
And the
and
book
so
is
that
called
chap-
The Critical Classroom, edited by Lindsay Burke, Jonathan Butcher, and J.P. Green.
And Bill and Ziev's chapter is a new policy report
From Independent
by the
Institute.
title, which is on our website, and we invite you to go and see it.
Thank you.
And we invite our friends always to visit our website, independent.org, because we are in the business of assembling a lot of careful information and analysis that can help you sort through a lot of these conundrums and confusions as best we can. Please do visit us at independent.org. And also, I just like to say that by the time we see our friends again on this platform of Independent Outlook, let's just hope that there's some kind of a negotiated compromise peace over there between Ukraine and Russia. And hopefully the U.S. and Western powers don't insist on some kind of repeat version of a punitive Versailles Treaty, but instead accept something that'll bring the hostility to an end for everybody's sake.
Right.
So with that hope in mind, we'll say goodbye to all of our friends. Invite you again to visit independent.org and also to come back and see us next time on Independent Outlook. Thanks, David. Thanks, Bill.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.